If there was one thing Sergeant First Class K. Thrix hated more than filing paperwork, it was having his perfectly organized training regimen disrupted by special cases. And standing before him now, in all her gravity-defying glory, was the most special case the Galactic Military Academy had ever seen. Cadet Blackwood K. Thrix's mandibles clicked in what his species considered a sigh. You understand that your presence here requires significant adjustments to our standardized protocols. Zara Blackwood stood at attention, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead, fighting back the smirk that threatened to break her professional demeanor. At 6, she towered over the insectoid sergeant, though she knew better than to mention that particular detail. "Yes, Sergeant First Class," she replied, her voice steady despite the fact that the Academy's 0.7 standard gravity made her feel like she could bounce off the walls at any moment. "I've reviewed the modifications to accommodate my unique physiological requirements." From across the training yard, Training Officer Velder watched the exchange with all 4 of his eyes narrowed in concentration. The Serpentine officer had spent the last 3 cycles teaching cadets from across the galaxy, but never had he encountered a Deathworlder in person. The very term made his scales itch. "Unique physiological requirements," Velder muttered to himself, slithering closer. "That's a polite way of saying she's from a planet that should, by all reasonable measures, be completely uninhabitable." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Academy's training grounds, where various species of cadets were already beginning their daily routines. The Flotians were practicing their low-gravity maneuvers, their gossamer-like bodies drifting gracefully through specially designated anti-grav zones. The Crystallians were conducting their morning resonance exercises, their crystalline forms humming in perfect harmony. And then there was Blackwood, who had already broken 3 unbreakable training dummies during her initial assessment. Perhaps K. Thrix suggested, his antennae twitching nervously, "We should review the safety protocols one more time. Your species has a rather concerning tendency to exceed expected force parameters." Zara's smirk finally broke through. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I've been holding back. Earth's gravity is 1.4 times what you consider standard. Every move I make here feels like I'm dancing through cotton candy." Cotton candy. K. Thrix's translator struggled with the concept, producing a series of confused clicks. "Never mind," Zara said quickly, remembering the disastrous attempt to explain Earth's snack foods to her alien classmates. That particular incident had ended with 2 gaseous entity cadets convinced that humans routinely consumed solidified clouds. Training Officer Velder finally reached their position, his serpentine body coiling into the formal posture of authority. "Cadet Blackwood, your previous academic records are impressive. Top marks in theoretical physics, despite your species' relatively primitive understanding of universal constants." "Thank you, Sir," Zara replied, choosing not to mention that humans had a habit of treating universal constants more like universal suggestions. However, Velder continued, "Academic achievement is one thing. The physical demands of the Academy's training program are designed to push cadets to their absolute limits. Even with the modified parameters, I have concerns." K. Thrix's mandibles clicked in agreement. "The last time we attempted to integrate a Deathworlder into the program, he trailed off, his compound eyes glazing over at the memory." "That was a Martian," Sir Zara pointed out helpfully. "We Earthers have much better impulse control. Usually." The usually hung in the air like a poorly timed joke at a funeral. Before either instructor could respond, the morning alert sounded across the training grounds, its harmonic frequencies calibrated to be perceptible to all known sentient species. It was time for the day's first challenge. As Zara moved to join her fellow cadets, K. Thrix and Velder exchanged worried glances. They had modified the training protocols, reinforced the equipment, and even installed new safety barriers rated for 3 times the previous maximum force threshold. But watching their human cadet practically skip toward the assembly area, her movements far too energetic for the current gravity, both instructors couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't modified things nearly enough. "Did you see that?" K. Thrix whispered to Velder. "She just covered 30 meters like it was nothing." "Indeed," Velder replied, his scales shifting colors in agitation. "And I don't think she even noticed she was doing it." The day was just beginning, and already the laws of physics were starting to sweat. The annual physical assessment day at the Galactic Military Academy was traditionally a well-orchestrated dance of mediocrity. Carefully designed to accommodate the average capabilities of 17 different species. Today, however, that dance was about to turn into what humans might call a mosh pit. Attention! Cadets Training Officer Veldur's voice resonated across the assembly area. Today's assessment will evaluate your physical capabilities across 12 standardized challenges. Each station has been calibrated for most species' natural limitations. The pause before most wasn't subtle. Neither was the way every cadet's attention shifted to Zara, who was absently juggling 3 heavy training orbs that were supposed to be unmovable by any single cadet. Next to her, Cadet PH Lore, a luminescent whose body was composed primarily of organized light waves, dimmed noticeably. Blackwood, those orbs are meant for group coordination exercises. They're density locked. Zara caught all 3 orbs and quickly set them down, looking sheepish. Sorry, just nervous energy. You know how it is. No PH Lore flickered. No, we really don't. Sergeant K. Thrix moved to the front of the assembly, his mandibles working overtime as he activated the holographic display of the obstacle course. The course begins with the low-gravity adaptation zone, designed to test your ability to maintain control in varying gravitational conditions. A gaseous entity cadet named Mist Within Winds wafted closer to Zara. Last cycle, 3 cadets failed this section by floating away. They had to send a retrieval drone. Floating away won't be my problem, Zara muttered, eyeing the course's first section. Not dispersing might be yours, though. Mist Within Winds condensed indignantly. I have excellent particle cohesion. Thank you very much. The hologram shifted to show the second stage. The sensory deprivation maze K. Thrix continued will test your ability to navigate using your species' secondary and tertiary senses. What counts as a secondary sense for humans? Asked X227, a crystallian whose silicon-based body sparkled with morning light, since you only have the standard 5 primary ones. Zara grinned. Spite. Spite is our secondary sense. That's not in any of the xenobiology textbooks, X227 chimed worriedly. The third stage, Veldur interrupted, his scales shifting to warning colors, is the strength calibration chamber. This year we've had to adjust the parameters significantly. His upper eyes fixed on Zara, while his lower ones consulted a datapad. The maximum force threshold has been increased by 300%. A wave of murmurs rippled through the assembled cadets. The Flotians, in particular, looked like they might faint, which, given their near-zero density, could result in them actually floating away. The remainder of the course, K. Thrix clicked rapidly, clearly trying to move past the awkward moment, includes the standard agility circuit, the multi-environmental adaptation chamber, and the team coordination challenge. Zara raised her hand. Question about the team coordination challenge, sir. Last time we practiced, I accidentally launched my partner into orbit. That was me, PH Lord dimmed accusingly. I spent 3 hours as a scattered light spectrum before they could realign my wavelengths. Which is precisely why Veldur interjected. We've implemented new safety protocols. All partners will be tethered using quantum lock stability fields, and Cadet Blackwood will be wearing power dampeners. The human cadet looked down at the heavy bands around her wrists and ankles. They were supposedly designed to reduce her strength to acceptable levels. So far, they mostly succeeded in making her feel like she was wearing slightly heavy bracelets. These dampeners, K. Thrix added, are rated for containing small black holes. They should be sufficient. Should be, someone whispered in the back. A temporal flux being named tick between talks raised an appendage. According to my probability calculations, there's a 73.4% chance that the human will inadvertently create at least one temporal paradox during the assessment. That was one time, Zara protested. And I maintain that causing a localized time loop during hand-to-hand combat was a valid strategy. You punched Lieutenant Kronos so hard he met his own grandfather. He got better. Veldur's scales had shifted to a distinct shade of stress-induced mauve. Let me be clear, there will be no temporal paradoxes, no accidental launches into orbit, and absolutely no attempts to test the structural integrity of the quantum containment fields. This is a standardized assessment, and it will proceed in a standard manner. The assembled cadets nodded in agreement, though several kept a noticeable distance from Zara. Only Mist Within Winds seemed unperturbed, possibly because being a sentient gas cloud made one relatively immune to most forms of physical mishap. Right then K-Thrix concluded, his antennae twitching with barely contained anxiety. "Proceed to your assigned starting positions." And Cadet Blackwood, "Yes, Sergeant. Please try to remember that gravity is not, as you put it last week, more of a suggestion than a rule." Zara smiled innocently as she took her place at the starting line, the power dampeners humming softly against her skin. Around her, the other cadets prepared themselves, each species bringing their unique abilities and limitations to bear. The assessment was about to begin, and somewhere in the universe, the laws of physics were probably filing for protective custody. The low-gravity adaptation zone stretched before the cadets like a twisted dream of an anti-gravity engineer who'd had too much Centaurian whiskey. Floating obstacles, randomly shifting gravity wells, and crystalline barriers designed to shatter if touched with too much force filled the space. "Begin," Deathworlder announced, his scales already shifting to anxiety purple. The first batch of cadets entered the zone. The Floatians excelled naturally, their gossamer bodies dancing through the low-gravity sections with practiced ease. The Crystallians moved with precise, calculated steps, their silicon forms reflecting light in dazzling patterns. Then it was Zara's turn. "Remember, Cadet Blackwood." K-Thrix clicked nervously. "The power dampeners are for your own SAF." She was already moving. But not like the others. Where they floated, she bounded. Where they drifted, she ricocheted. The human moved through the constantly shifting gravity fields like a pinball in a machine designed by a madman. That's not possible," one of the observing instructors muttered. "She's using the varying gravity fields to build momentum." Is she? K-Thrix's mandibles clicked rapidly in distress. Is she calculating the gravitational vectors in her head? Zara launched herself off a floating platform, twisted in midair to avoid a crystalline barrier, and used the momentum from a sudden gravity shift to slingshot herself through 3 consecutive rings. The power dampeners whined in protest. "Oh no," HFY dimmed dramatically. "She's doing physics again." From his observation post, Deathworlder frantically consulted his datapad. According to all known laws of motion, what she's doing should result in immediate loss of control and probable dispersion across multiple gravity wells. "You're assuming she respects the laws of motion." Mist within winds condensed thoughtfully. "I don't think humans ask physics for permission. They just sort of do things and dare physics to stop them." The next section was the sensory deprivation maze. Most species relied on their secondary or tertiary senses to navigate its pitch-black corridors. The Crystallians used harmonic resonance. The gaseous entities detected minute pressure differences. The temporal flux beings perceived probabilistic pathways through time. Zara walked through whistling. "Another one bites the dust." "She's not even using any sensory enhancement technology," K-Thrix protested. "How is she navigating?" "I memorized the layout during the briefing," Zara called out cheerfully. "Also, these walls have a really distinctive echo, and they smell like ionic discharge." "Humans can smell ionic discharge," X227 chimed in disbelief. "No idea. But it seemed like a good guess since my hair's standing on end." The strength calibration chamber came next. Here, at least, the instructors felt confident. They'd reinforced everything with quantum-stabilized materials designed to withstand forces up to 300% of standard levels. Zara examined the first challenge, a series of weighted doors that required precisely calibrated force to open without triggering the failure sensors. She cracked her knuckles. Cadet Deathworlder warned, "Remember that finesse is more important than." The human had already grabbed the first door. Instead of pushing it directly, she applied pressure at a seemingly random angle, using the door's own weight distribution against it. The mechanism clicked open smoothly. Did she just tick between talks gaped with all of their temporal apertures? Did she just exploit the door's moment of inertia to reduce the required force by 78.3%? That's not the approved technique. K-Thrix's antennae were practically tied in knots. Show-off HFY flickered as Zara proceeded to open the remaining doors using increasingly improbable applications of basic physics principles. The multi-environmental adaptation chamber presented environments ranging from underwater sequences to vacuum-exposed sections. Each cadet was equipped with standard environmental protection gear. Zara took one look at her assigned protective suit and raised her hand. "Permission to attempt this section without the full gear, sir." Absolutely not, chorused every instructor within earshot. But humans can hold their breath for. No. She completed the section in the suit, but somehow managed to make the standardized environmental gear look like it was an optional suggestion rather than a survival necessity. Did anyone else notice mist within winds swirled thoughtfully, that she actually went faster in the high-pressure sections? Like she was enjoying it. Deathworlders X-227 chimed with a shudder. Their entire evolutionary history is just one long series of their planet trying to kill them and them deciding that was fun. The final challenge, the team coordination exercise, had been modified specifically with Zara in mind. The power dampeners were set to maximum. The quantum-locked stability fields hummed with enough energy to hold small moons in orbit. Zara was paired with PH Lore, who had only recently forgiven her for the orbital incident. I promised to be gentle, Zara assured her partner. That's what you said last time, PH Lore dimmed accusingly, right before I achieved escape velocity. The exercise required pairs to navigate an obstacle course while linked by energy tethers, requiring perfect synchronization of movement and force application. Most teams moved cautiously, carefully coordinating each step. Zara and PH Lore's approach was different. Physics suggests, Zara mused, eyeing a particularly challenging section, that if I anchor myself here and use the tether's elastic properties. No, PH Lore flickered in alarm. No physics. We agreed no physics. But it was too late. Zara had already begun implementing whatever calculation she'd worked out in her head. The power dampeners sparked. The stability fields fluctuated. PH Lore's luminescent form stretched into a spectrum of panic. Fascinating, Velder noted, his scales cycling through colors previously unknown to chromatic science. She's using the quantum-locked field's own containment properties to create a localized energy loop. But that's not what it's designed for, K-Thrix protested. Try telling her that mist within winds sighed, watching as Zara and a very vocal PH Lore executed a series of moves that looked less like a military exercise and more like an interpretive dance piece about the death of causality. They completed the course in record time, though PH Lore refused to solidify into a coherent wavelength for several minutes afterward. As the assessment concluded, the instructors huddled around their datapads, trying to figure out how to score what they'd just witnessed. The other cadets maintained a respectful distance from Zara, who was helping PH Lore reintegrate their scattered light particles. Well, tick between talks observed, checking their temporal indices. At least she didn't create any paradoxes this time. The day's not over yet, PH Lore flickered weakly. K-Thrix and Velder exchanged looks of resigned acceptance. Somehow they'd have to write a report about this. Somewhere in the universe, a physics textbook spontaneously burst into flames. And Zara? She was already asking about next week's advanced combat training, her power dampeners smoking gently in the afternoon light. In the aftermath of the physical assessment, the Academy's top scientific minds gathered in conference room C-137, desperately trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Holoprojectors displayed recordings of Zara's performance from multiple angles, while a quantum computer attempted to process the calculations she'd apparently done in her head. Professor N. Vex, the Academy's lead physicist, stood before his colleagues, his tentacles twitching with academic distress. As you can see from these readings, Cadet Blackwood isn't so much breaking the laws of physics as she is aggressively negotiating with them. That's not how physics works, shouted Dr. Lyra 9, her crystalline form vibrating with indignation. You can't negotiate with universal constants. Apparently, Sergeant K-Thrix clicked dryly. Nobody told the humans that. The holoprojector switched to show Zara's performance in the low-gravity adaptation zone. Professor N. Vex pointed with 3 tentacles simultaneously. Notice how she's using what she calls parkour, a term that roughly translates to making gravity cry in standard galactic. Her species evolved on a high-gravity world with varying terrain, leading them to develop this bizarre ability to treat vertical surfaces as optional suggestions. Training Officer Velder's scales had been stuck on confused teal for the past hour. But what about the power dampeners? They were rated for black hole containment. Ah, yes, Dr. Lyra 9 chimed in, her crystalline structure resonating with embarrassment. We made the classic mistake of assuming that limiting her strength would be sufficient. We failed to account for her species, creative problem-solving capabilities. The recording showed Zara using the dampener's own weight as counterbalance points, somehow turning what should have been a hindrance into an advantage. It's like giving a lever to someone who's already decided the universe is their fulcrum, Professor Nvex explained, all 8 eyes blinking in sequence. K-Thrix pulled up his notes from previous training sessions. According to our initial species assessment, humans have several critical disadvantages: limited sensory input, no natural armor, no inherent energy manipulation abilities. Limited sensory input, Veldur interrupted, his scales flickering. She navigated the sensory deprivation maze by whistling at it. Apparently, humans can process acoustic feedback without specialized organs. They just do it. With their ears, their regular, non-enhanced, evolutionary basic ears. Professor Nvex's tentacles tied themselves in a knot, which for his species indicated deep theoretical distress. Their supposed disadvantages appear to have forced them to develop alternative approaches. Take their lack of natural armor, for instance. Instead of evolving protective plating, they developed something far more terrifying: pattern recognition and predictive modeling. You mean Dr. Lyra 9's crystalline surface frosted with horror? They just look at something dangerous and figure out how to not let it hit them. Precisely. And their limited strength compared to some species. They compensated by developing an intuitive understanding of mechanical advantage that borders on the mystical. The holoprojector showed Zara in the strength calibration chamber, using leverage points that the chamber's designers hadn't even known existed. But surely, K-Thrix clicked hopefully, their lack of energy manipulation abilities is a genuine disadvantage. Veldur's scales shifted to hysterical chartreuse. They turned that into an advantage too. Because they can't naturally sense energy fields, they develop mathematics to predict them instead. Cadet Blackwood wasn't sensing the gravity fluctuations, she was calculating their patterns. That's not even the worst part, Professor Nvex added, his tentacles finally untangling. Remember how we classified their endurance capabilities as moderate? Everyone in the room groaned. They'd all read the reports about human persistence hunting, the terrifying practice of simply following prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. So what you're saying, Dr. Lyra 9 crystallized the thought, is that everything we classified as a disadvantage has been weaponized by evolution and their species' frightening tendency to look at possible death and think I can work with this, Professor Nvex confirmed. K-Thrix pulled up the Academy's original species capability assessment for humans. The document was now covered in so many revision marks, it looked like it had been attacked by an editor with a grudge. We'll need to completely rewrite the human section of the training manual, he clicked resignedly. Any suggestions? Step 1, Veldur offered, his scales settling into a calm blue of acceptance. Stop assuming that impossible means the same thing to them as it does to us. Step 2, Dr. Lyra 9 chimed. Acknowledge that their understanding of physics isn't wrong, it's just aggressively optimistic. And Step 3, Professor Nvex concluded. All 8 eyes focused on the holo recording of Zara casually defying several fundamental forces. Pray they never realize that the only real limits they have are the ones they believe in. The room fell silent as they watched the human cadet help her traumatized partner reassemble their scattered light particles, apparently unconcerned that she'd just rewritten several chapters of physics textbooks. Should we be worried, K-Thrix? Asked no one in particular. Oh, absolutely. Professor Nvex's tentacles formed the academic gesture for fascinated terror, but mostly for the physics exam next week. I have a feeling we're going to need a new grading curve. This is a joke, right? Zara stared at the holographic display of the final challenge, for once looking genuinely uncertain. Even by human standards, this is ambitious. Before her loomed the Academy's legendary impossible course, a training ground so demanding it had been classified as a theoretical exercise rather than an actual physical challenge. No cadet had ever attempted it, mainly because attempting it violated several laws of thermodynamics. The impossible course training officer Veldur announced, his scales a peculiar shade of anticipatory gold, was designed by an ancient race of hyper-intelligent energy beings who had transcended physical form. It exists simultaneously in 3 different phase states and requires the participant to manipulate quantum probability fields directly. So completely impossible, then missed within winds condensed hopefully. Not exactly, Sergeant K-Thrix clicked, his antennae twitching with what might have been mischief. The course designers left one theoretical solution. It requires perfect synchronization of physical force, temporal awareness, and energy manipulation. The calculations alone would take a supercomputer 3 years to process. Zara walked around the hologram, her eyes narrowing in that particularly human way that made the instructors nervous. It was the same look she'd had before explaining why she thought the plasma containment field would make an excellent trampoline. Those rings are oscillating between dimensions, she observed, and that central platform exists in quantum superposition. Precisely, Professor N-Vex's tentacles waved excitedly. The only way to complete the course would be to somehow maintain coherent form while existing in multiple quantum states simultaneously, all while calculating multidimensional vectors in real time. Right, Zara nodded, cracking her knuckles. But what if we didn't do any of that? The assembled staff and cadets stared at her. I'm sorry, PH Lore flickered in confusion, but did you just suggest ignoring the fundamental nature of quantum reality? Well, yes, Zara gestured at the course. Look, all these fancy quantum fields and dimensional shifts are really just trying to get from point A to point B while avoiding points C through Z, right? So instead of playing by the course's rules. Oh no, K-Thrix clicked in horror. She's about to do human physics again. W. Make the course play by our rules, Zara finished triumphantly. Professor N-Vex's tentacles tied themselves into a new knot previously unknown to xenobiologists. That's not how reality works. Has anyone ever tried to find out? Zara asked innocently. Before anyone could stop her, not that they had much success with that. Historically, she stepped onto the course's entry platform. The quantum probability fields immediately began to fluctuate around her. Cadet Blackwood Veldur's scales shifted rapidly through warning colors. The energy requirements alone make this impossible. The power dampeners won't. Oh, these old things. Zara glanced at her dampeners, which had started smoking again. I figured out they don't actually dampen power, they just store it. Been charging them up all day. UV, what chorused every instructor within earshot. But Zara was already moving. Instead of attempting to exist in multiple quantum states, she simply didn't. Where the course demanded complex dimensional calculations, she applied what she later described as aggressive Newtonian mechanics. The power dampeners glowed brighter with each movement, their stored energy becoming part of her solution rather than her limitation. Is she tick between talks gaped? Is she using the dampener's stored energy to create localized pockets of classical physics within the quantum field? That's not possible. Dr. Lyra Nine's crystalline form vibrated with disbelief. You can't just decide which physics you want to use. Humans can mist within winds swirled excitedly. They just pick whichever laws of physics they like best and ignore the rest. The assembled cadets watched in awe as Zara tackled the course not by solving its quantum puzzles, but by creating conditions where those puzzles couldn't exist. She used the dampener's stored energy to generate fields of pure stubbornness, zones where reality had no choice but to play along with her interpretation of how things should work. This is unprecedented, Professor N-Vex muttered, his tentacles now so knotted they'd achieved sentience. She's not breaking the laws of physics, she's creating localized regions where classical physics is more convincing than quantum physics. She's what K-Thrix clicked frantically. She's winning an argument with reality, Velder translated, his scales having given up and settled on a color best described as existential confusion. The final segment of the course required the participant to exist in 3 dimensions simultaneously while solving a temporal paradox. Zara's solution? She used the last of the dampener's stored energy to create a feedback loop that made the paradox resolve itself out of sheer embarrassment. As she stepped off the exit platform, the course's quantum fields collapsed behind her with what sounded suspiciously like a sigh of relief. The power dampeners fell off her wrists and ankles, completely drained of energy and somehow tied in knots. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several physics textbooks spontaneously rewriting themselves. Well, Zara grinned, brushing some interdimensional dust off her uniform. That was fun. What's next? The other cadets stared at her with a new understanding. They'd just witnessed someone convince reality itself to take a coffee break, and she thought it was fun. Deathworlders X-227 chimed softly, don't just survive impossible conditions, they domesticate them. Professor N-Vex looked at his ruined notes, then at the human cadet, then back at his notes. I believe he said carefully, We're going to need a new definition of impossible. And stronger power dampeners, Thrix added. And better insurance, Velder concluded, his scales finally settling on a color that could only be described as respectful terror. Zara just smiled, already eyeing the next impossible challenge with that distinctly human look of someone who saw the laws of physics more as polite suggestions than actual rules. 2 weeks after what became known as the incident, and what physics professors across the galaxy were calling the Great Relativistic Rebellion, the Academy's board gathered for their emergency curriculum revision meeting. Motion to officially classify human physics as its own separate field of study, Professor N. Vex asked, his tentacles still slightly knotted from attempting to write the incident report. Seconded, clicked Thrix, who hadn't stopped twitching since watching Zara convince quantum mechanics to take a day off. Motion carries, Velder announced, his scales now permanently stuck on a new color officially named Human-Induced Anxiety Blue now, about the training protocols. The holoscreen displayed the extensive list of changes required after Zara's performance. The list was longer than most academic dissertations and included several items that made senior physicists wake up screaming. First, N. Vex read, all future obstacle courses must be designed with the understanding that humans view the impossible as a personal challenge. Second, power dampeners are to be reclassified as power storage devices that make humans more dangerous. Third, Thrix added, the phrase "that's not how physics works" is to be banned from all training sessions involving Deathworlders. It only encourages them. The board members nodded sagely, several of them still recovering from watching their carefully constructed understanding of universal constants being treated like a suggestion box. We should also, Velder noted, revise our species capability assessments. Apparently, listing something as a critical disadvantage just motivates humans to turn it into an improbable advantage. Speaking of improbable, Professor N. Vex interjected, has anyone figured out how to untangle the temporal knot Cadet Blackwood left in the quantum probability field? 3 of our best temporal mechanics tried to study it and came back speaking in palindromes. Leave it, Thrix suggested. Consider it a monument to why we should never assume we understand human limitations. The meeting continued, each new protocol revision more absurd than the last. They created a new safety classification technically possible, but please don't they established emergency protocols for when humans decided to improve standard equipment. They even drafted a guide titled, So You Think You Can Predict Human Behavior, a Cautionary Tale. As they wrapped up, a junior instructor rushed in, looking panicked. Sirs, we have a situation in Training Hall B. Cadet Blackwood was helping to redesign the standard training simulations and, well, what did she do? They asked in unison, dreading the answer. She suggested we could improve efficiency by running all the simulations simultaneously in the same space. And then she proved it was possible. A collective groan filled the room. Somewhere in the distance they could hear reality itself throwing up its hands in surrender. Add it to the list, Velder sighed, his scales shifting to resignation purple. And someone please make sure she hasn't taught any other cadets how to fold space-time. The last thing we need is an entire class deciding that dimensional barriers are optional. As the board members filed out, Professor N. Vex paused to add one final note to the new training manual when dealing with human cadets. Remember that their greatest strength isn't their physical capabilities, their problem-solving skills, or even their disturbing ability to make physics reconsider its life choices. It's their unshakable conviction that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet. Below that, in smaller text, may whatever higher powers exist help us all when they discover the advanced theoretical physics department. We've hidden it in a pocket dimension, but knowing humans, they'll probably think that's cute. And at the very bottom, added by Thrix note for future instructors, if a human says, watch this, evacuate immediately. It's already too late for the laws of physics, but you might still save yourself. The Academy would never be the same. But then again, neither would physics.